Hey guys, this is Rick, the Grease Man, and we are coming back at you with another tidbit or a literal opinion of Bob Lazar, the man. Now, I'm sure that if you think about this, pretty much everybody in our life, everybody has somebody that's a bit eccentric in their family, that off the wall or off kilter, that non-stop idea person who's got a hundred ideas for something, and is always unlike people who think about it and talk about it, are actually trying to achieve something, whether you know them directly in your members of family or an extended family or somebody in the neighborhood that you know. There's always that off oddball person. Right now, we talked about Bob Lazar and his story a little bit. We talked about his education and possible discrepancies a little bit, and taking it literally for what he says and as the person, not speculating that this could be made up or what would be his motivations. I'm looking at this. What if this is the God's truth, right? And so, why would Los Alamos, let alone an S4 project of some secret dark government project assembly or whatever, want to hire somebody like Bob Lazar to work for him? And so one of those things I thought, what is that makes this guy stand out a little different from everybody else? You know, we can look at, let's see if I got my right notes here, because, yeah. In 1977, Bob Lazar created a rocket bike. It says here he's first one of the three people, the third person to take this type of particular rocket and strap it to a bike. And that bike, just looking at the bike alone, reminds me of somebody in my hometown that had something similar to it, although we never strapped a bike to it or a rocket to it. But the concept was possible. The idea was plausible. There was always somebody who thought, geez, what can we do? So, like I said, many of us know men or women like Bob. They're smart, they're driven, they're quite eccentric, they easily become bored and less busy and are making progress in their current projects. They tend to jump from project to project. I had an uncle, he's passed away now, but he was a similar type. He was a self-made, self-educated person. He never went on to any great inventions or any great significant things, but he dabbled in a lot of stuff, and whenever he got bored, he moved on to something else. And he never could quite keep up with what he was trying to do to the next thing. And then, like most young men back in the 70s, I was very young man in the 70s. I was in my pre-teens or post-teens, 10, 11, that kind of stuff. I graduated in 85, so that tells you right there. So, like most young men back then in the 70s, we pretended and fantasized about rocket bikes and flight and speed. Unlike us, Bob actually did something about it. He built rocket bikes. He built a jet car later and raced it. He was involved in jet racing, and he acknowledges that that was somewhat of a passing fad, and then now there's very few people that engage in that sort of thing now. And then even later in life, after the events that he's known for occurred, he tried to put his life back together, or put it back on progress, and got involved in dabbling in hydrogen-powered vehicles, attempting to make a hydrogen-powered car, which would get 400 miles to the gallon. Which he. If you think the technology is pliable, he proved and demonstrated. He's not the only one who's proved and demonstrated that that kind of technology is pliable, and yet we do not see any of that sort of thing today. We're moving on to electric cars with lithium batteries and things like this. They're still hideously expensive. Fuel is still an issue. Apparently, people considered hydrogen with the hydrogen bomb and are quite reluctant to have a vehicle they think might blow up on them at some point in case. And I can't 100% argue with me or make that argument myself. I mean, the man is definitely an out of the box thinker. He's an experimenter. He is a tinkerer. He is somebody who goes beyond the dream and talk stage like so many of us do. This is the sort of guy with an education, even a modest education, but being able to give you a practical uses and put that knowledge to work, or find what knowledge he needs to do the thing he wants to do. This is the kind of guy you might want on a project when you're trying to understand something that's so sophisticated, so annoyingly simple. Because if you listen to the descriptions of the power source for these craft, it's almost anticlimactic. They're so sophisticated, they're simple. They're so beyond our capabilities that we can't see the tree for the forest. And the devices themselves are just several components that, when put together, react with each other and are powered off of a substance that may or may not be element 115. And yet, if you look at our most sophisticated computers today still have gobs of components and are very inefficient compared to what they could be. And they're hundreds of times more efficient than they were 50 years ago. It's just like engines. The atomic power plants that they can construct for the Navy, for example, are far more efficient than they were in the 50s, and much more compact than they were in the 50s. And yet they're still terribly inefficient and terribly dangerous and heavily full of stuff. Pipes and wires and gizmos and doodads and so on and so forth. It's just so many things that go together. So when you look at something that's so highly sophisticated, and when they say, well, it's, they're a million years ahead of us. Well, maybe they are a million, and maybe they're not. Maybe they're 1,000 years ahead of us. It doesn't matter, because their technology is to the point where simplicity, it's gone full circle. I mean, their complexity is simplistic compared to what we consider technology, which makes it almost impossible. So when you get somebody who's some of these diehard physicists, or these diehard science guys who want to put everything in absolutes, and everything is absolute, absolutely. I probably need to do a video on that. But in my mind, I look at this, and I'm Joe Q. Public. I'm a layman. Like I said, junior college, if you want to go that route. I mean, I don't have any kind of huge repertoire of scientific anything to back this up on, other than common sense and a worldview a little bit, and a wild imagination to some extent, is to look at these guys and say, okay, so you've got this PhD with 6 other PhDs or whatever's in his pocket or in her pocket going on, that defies everything we know about physics. It defies everything we know about science. It's just impossible. So they're absolutely they've already shut out the possibility that there might be something that's not in our already knowledgeable data records and our already knowledgeable toolbox. If it's something they can't wrap their fingers around immediately, and obviously it can't be possible. And yet, if you go through history, even most recently, you go back through history, that time and time and time again, science was proven that science was necessarily wrong, but they were proven that there are, and a lot of things out there that are beyond or different from what we know. So, once upon a time, the world was flat. They proved it wasn't flat. Once upon a time, people believed you could not fly. We have long since proved you can fly with assistance. You cannot go into outer space. You can with technological assistance. You can go to the depths of the ocean with technological assistance. We have found mechanical ways to do the impossible over and over and over again. And we see these things today. In my lifetime, I remember as a kid, the idea of carrying my phone and my household phone and information in my pocket was absurd. It just outside of Star Trek. I mean, I saw Star Trek, and I saw the communicators, and I saw the tricorders, and I thought, oh, that'll be a cool thing. But I didn't envision it until, that they would come around in my lifetime. And how we literally have the internet at our fingertips wherever we go. There's technological talk about, having the ability to have these things implanted in us so we don't need to carry it. We have an internal device, which, we have a moral and social issue with that. But the fact of the matter is, it's plausible. So when people sit there and say absolute is absolute, I know absolute zero is absolute zero. If you understand the concept of absolute zero, you cannot get colder than zero absolute. And yet I make arguments with people occasionally that, is that true? Is absolute zero only absolute because we think it's absolute? Or is it possible on a microscopic level or on a multiple dimensional level or some other technological level that absolute zero can actually be more zero than zero? Can there be a zero factor to the factor of something else? Probably not, but I don't know that you can and can't say without 100, absolute certainty that anything is impossible, especially things that are improbable. When we look at the possibilities of technology, we look at something that somebody else created. If I took a cell phone today and we went back to ancient Egypt with it, obviously the people in Egypt would first off be very unhappy with my presence in the first place because I don't speak ancient ancient Egyptian. I don't look like Egyptians. I surely wouldn't be dressed like one when I first got there. And I got this gizmo in my hand that suddenly starts translating for me and telling them what I'm telling them. I'm likely to become an experiment somehow. In other cultures, and not much more closer to our modern era, would see me burned at the stake or put in a pit and stoned to death. It's just practicality, right? So we look at the technology. Its simplicity, on the side of simplicity, makes it so it's magical, and it's because of that certain people would go in and automatically dismiss the possibility. They just couldn't cope with it. They wouldn't handle it. So there's another reason why, if you have this super secret project with some technology that's so out there, so far out there, bringing the traditional absolute PhD fellows into the room and pointing at it, potentially would make it so they would guarantee that they wouldn't achieve anything because they wouldn't be able to accept the possibility of it. So when we look at, like I said, here we're back to Bob. He later dabbled with hydrogen power cars, even to the extent of constructing a rig to extract the hyperbides, or the fuel itself from the hydrogen in his backyard. There's videos on that on YouTube of this big gizmo that concerned some of his neighbors, apparently. Bob appears to be the sort who's also looking for a means to financially support himself while leaving himself time to do things that he wants to do. That's also common. He's a businessman, but not a very good one. From what I understand, he's got a number of possible businesses going, and he's had several going off and on over the years. He was developing film to make money. Why else would you develop film, especially back then? Nowadays, it'd be specially because very few people use film anymore. He has his pocket business of repairing radar detectors for Los Alamos, for example. There's articles on that. It's on the internet. I saw them and talked about it, or talked about technicians wanted to do that sort of work. It was a job ad, actually. I think I downloaded it, but I didn't add it to my little collection of stuff here. But the fact is, it's there. And so he potentially could have answered it. And if he was looking for things to do to generate extra income on the side, and he's a business kind of minded guy where he wants to do things and then get other people to do the work for him, which is traditional for a lot of businesses. I come up with the idea, and now I'm going to hire you to do the actual grunt work so I can make money and work on other things. And you can make money by getting paid from me. So we're going to take on this thing for them and do it. In the case of the radar detector or the radar detection devices. And that's what we're saying. While working at Los Alamos, he started a small business or hired someone to refurbish these detectors. And so maybe he saw the opportunity and jumped on the board, and this is where he gets that. I worked at Los Alamos, or I worked at Los Alamos, and then on the side I did these as well. And we can't prove that I did this, but I can prove that I did that. It just makes for some convoluted things. But these eccentric type people tend to do that sort of stuff. They tend to think outside that box, and not always successful. Like I said, my uncle, one year back in the 70s, he spent $7,000-8,000 in '70s money, which was a huge amount of money, on these really high-end carpet and upholstery cleaning devices. These early rug doctors, the damn things the size of a freaking, a very, very heavy trunk, and he was 2 or 3 of these things, and he started it and then quickly got bored with it. Next thing you know, these things got shoved up under the porch and they went, they rotted away. A lot of money invested and he moved on to the next project. They had a garage. It was huge. He got this idea he's going to have a ceramic business, so he bought a kiln and all these molds. He got a good deal on them. He set up some classes, etc., etc. But he just couldn't generate enough interest from the locals. People didn't want to come in for the classes in large numbers. He couldn't find a way to create enough of these ceramics and then go through the process of using them to do to make money to justify it. And then eventually he lost interest in that, moved on to another thing, and then unfortunately it's assumed his oldest daughter did something in the garage and set the garage on fire and burned it to the ground. And we know this, the assumption is because every place she's ever lived, she passed away a few years back from the after effects of a recluse spider bite, but she had a fire pretty much everywhere she ever lived, and every house they ever lived in when she was growing up had at least one fire. So you make up what you will of that. So he opened up his photo development lab. Great way to think about it for a minute. While plenty of photo maps, 1-hour photos and things like that were around in the 70s and 80s, since everybody used photo film cameras. I still have 1 or 2 of those things floating around. This is opening up a photo development business is also a great way to obtain all kinds of various chemicals and elements that a would-be scientist, tinkerer, experimenter might want to have access to, and do so in such a manner that wouldn't look odd going down to try to purchase these things. I have a business, I can purchase these things in bulk or in numbers, and I can add this or add that to it too and slightly justify it without saying, just getting strange looks if you walk in. Nowadays, if you'd walk in and want certain chemicals, or just getting too much fertilizer for your garden can have somebody from the authorities decide to make a visit to your house and see what you're up to. So, excuse me on that. The fact that you open that photo development, it's a great way of making, like I said, accessing materials without getting some raised eyebrows, making some additional money on the side, without knowing exactly what kind of photos he was developing. It's hard to know. I imagine he was either, I don't think it's the neighbor's family photos, but what do I know? Maybe it was a mail order thing. That was a big way of doing business back in the 70s, because we take that for granted nowadays. Then we moved on to yet another potential business that got himself into some serious trouble. Also did not help with his credentials, but indirectly raised some great, like I said in the previous video, questions. The brothel incident. It's implied by the court records that he was accused of operating the brothel. He claims he was helping the owner by setting up a computer and some security cameras and helping him out. So he had a soft spot for this person. Somehow got to know him. We can only speculate, and we know that his wife cheated on him a few years earlier. So potentially, I don't think it was a nefarious attempt on his part. This Bob Lazar fellow acts like a lot of other eccentric types that are almost oblivious to things. This is how he talks and describes his first days of going to work for the S4 facility and for Los Alamos. He was greatly excited by the potential. Then he got bored. He got a little fearful too, but he got things weren't going very well. They weren't doing a good job of trying to scientifically study these things. They didn't have a complete laboratory and all the equipment they needed. And, that in and of itself reeks of true government bureaucracy. It makes it much more believable than if, say, he went into some place where this hyper secret facility had everything that you could potentially ever want, and the best of the best in technology that's not even on the open market, etc., etc. In fact, it's just some poorly equipped rooms in the back of a frickin' set of hangar bays in a warehouse buried into a side of a hill. Yeah, I mean, it's, people running the things are definitely not the type of people that need to be running those programs, because they have no concept of what it takes to, or what it ought to take to do proper research on something, especially something that's so simplistically complex that you can't get your hands around it. You just literally can't wrap your mind around the technology, because the technology is so advanced, so exotic, that it comes across, when you look at it physically, you just can't cope with it. I mean, that any pipes, any wires, any connectors, any of that stuff, by today's concept, a little more viable and believable, because our technology has advanced greatly. We can now recharge our cell phones and other things by just sitting on top of a charging platform. They don't necessarily, if you have the right phone, have to be actually physically plugged in. And we can, do things of similar nature. But there's other reasons why we don't broadcast live electricity through the air either, without having some very exotic ways of containing it. So we look at this brothel situation when, like I said, I could see this kind of guy, meeting up with somebody and then getting sucked into it, trying to be helpful because he likes the person. The lady that's running the show, he likes her, and then got to get, friendly because, for whatever reasons, and not necessarily in that hedonistic mindset way that some people might not apply to it. Instead, he's wanting to help her make her business more efficient and more productive and perhaps safer, because she's had some issues. So he suggests, hey, let's do this, and I can do that, and so on and so forth. And then suddenly, in the process of doing all this, he tells his buddy there that's in the newspaper, or the TV guy, and says, and he freaks out and says, oh, we need to protect your reputation and my reputation. We need to get out of this. And so what do? They try to go off to the side in a ham-fisted, not so criminal-minded way, saying to the cops, who are also supposedly boyfriends of this lady, or not friends of this lady, and then they overreact, and then we get this whole blown-up thing that ends up in court. And of course, while the court prosecutors typically wanted to make an example out of him, because they didn't feel that he was being contrite enough, or scared enough, or sorry enough, or whatever. I think Bob Lazar is one of those keeps his emotions pretty close to the chest. I don't think he thinks of that sort of thing until after the fact. He's a literal person in some aspects. I look at that from the perspective of the way he talks. Even 35, 40 years later, he still talks like it was just nothing. He acknowledges how big a thing this story is. His historian is working at S4 in Los Alamos, and so on and so forth, and these alien craft and so on and so forth. But you look at him, and he's not that exuberant about it. It's just like it's yet another thing in his life. So this brothel situation potentially played out the same way. So as like I said, when he goes in there, the court starts to get upset. It sounded like the judge was far more upset with the fact that they couldn't find any decent background on Bob Lazar. They all but outright accused him of being using a false name, and couldn't find any information because most of the records had been somehow misplaced. Well, it seems almost impossible by today's standards with electronics. And there's people who will argue, oh, sure, you can easily lose somebody's stuff today because it's all digital. We could go in and buy, well, it's not all digital. I'm sorry, but it's not. There's too many companies out there and corporations and the government that still use the old paper trail stuff. So you have a lot of digital information, and then you have a collage of paper information that goes in there. And the older you get, the more that accrues in different places. So this is where you get back in the day, before all this was digitized. Computers were still rare. Having physical files meant most of your stuff was in a manila envelope in somebody's file case. So potentially, if somebody walked into an office, when nobody's paying attention, or slipped somebody $50 to look the other way, walked over that file case, pulled your file out of that file case and walks off with it, there you go. There's your physical hardware, your backups, everything. You know, when digitally speaking, like this video, I'm posting it on YouTube. Well, it's going into the, you know, YouTube computers. It's up on the internet. It's in other places. Some of you are viewing them. Some of you are not. There you have it. It's going to be there for a long, long time. Right? We also know that he opened up something called Nuclear Labs, or some other little company he had, which was dealing with those radiation detectors and some other technologies and stuff. And recently I heard, because like I said, at my job, I spend a lot of time in my work truck driving from between customers and things like this. So I've been listening to all kinds of different interviews that Bob's done over the years. And that story is pretty consistent. There are some differences. There are some significant differences that hop up and down. So when I think about that, as a person, you know, you tell the same story over and over and over again, you'll buy into it no matter how crazy it is, if you buy into it. The other side is the fact that little details change, or you drop off or pick up. That's human nature. We're not literal computing machines. We don't have that, unless you got an eclectic memory, which most of us don't, and by all means Bob does not. There's no evidence of it. He doesn't claim to have it. Then the possibility that memory changes and things slightly different from each other. You know, I'll use an example, which may or may not work for you, but it works for me. When I mention the word crusader, a lot of people will immediately connect the word crusader with the Crusades. These people back in the Middle Ages who went from Europe to the Holy Land on these conflicts and wars and etc. etc. And I too will understand the concept of crusader in that context. But I also understand crusader is a form of a tank that was used by the British Army back in the day. There's also a form in a number of video games and a tabletop war game called Battletech and MechWarrior, who have a crusader as a combat mech. So, I mean, I can immediately think of one, and you might think of another, but we both understand what the other one's, you know, the crusader in our perspective means. So how we store that information and then later how we relate it to each other can come off as a bit strange or off or odd or misplaced. So it's not impossible. I know that in Joe Rogan's video podcast, Lazar Joe had asked him about what the interior of the spacecraft looked like that he was in, and he says, was there any control surfaces and things like that? And Bob says, well, there's no panels or no control surfaces as we know it. There's these arches, and one of these arches can become transparent and appears to have some kind of method of controlling the vessel through this arch or something, its functions, but not in the traditional sense of a control board as we know it. And yet, in an older video interview he did on a radio podcast from Las Vegas, probably 20 odd years ago, he mentioned that when he was in there, there were his description of the inside of the ship is different a little bit than what he has in Rogan's podcast. And he says there's a couple spots had been sawed off. He apparently might have had consoles, but they had been removed and crudely removed, so that meant we sawed them off. And then there was no mention of the arch itself. And then he said, oh yeah, there's a control panel. So he's, how he's remembering things can be different and changed over time, and I believe that that's plausible. Again, is he lying and making it up? It's just so convoluted that makes me literally believe that he believes what he's saying. So we go back to his eccentric life. At one point, Bob bought a share of a missile silo in Roswell with a partner, somebody named John, who has far more invested in it, Bob says, but he did invest in it, and they have some ideas and some concepts of what they want to use it for. Who the hell buys into a missile silo? Well, I can think of a lot of people who would like to buy into a missile silo, and we're talking an old one, obviously. He jokes, because Bob jokes about it, and they couldn't get a reload kit for it, obviously. But I know today there's a lot of people that are converting them to survival shelters, and some very elaborate and expensive ones. Others are, I've heard, being used to make to have mushroom farms and other practical uses. So, you know, it's the sort of thing an eccentric individual might involve themselves with if they have the opportunity, right? So, you know, I'm about done with this particular installment. Let's see. Well, I don't know if that shut that off or not. You know, I just love. Well, no, it's still recording. See, I bought a new laptop, and this one here has a timer. Apparently, I'm not fiddling with it enough, and it went blank. I thought maybe I'd lost the video, but you know, my old computer would crash since it didn't have a big enough CPU. This one has a much bigger CPU, thanks to our wonderful stimulus package money. I was able to replace my 3-year-old laptop with a slightly more powerful one. Anyway, so like I said, I had a couple things, but these were unrelated to him as to Bob the man. You know, he talks about nine different craft in different sizes, and the only one that Lazar knew anything about was the one he was that the power source he was supposed to study was connected to, and that was the one he had actually seen operating and had been in. He didn't know much about the others. I know that one of the things that I don't care about when it comes to critics or skeptics, I especially don't like these skeptic individuals who really don't do their homework very much. I mean, to be fair, I mean, I've watched a number of their videos too, different people's views and takes on Bob Lazar's story, and because I'm trying to have a fair and open-minded view of it. And a lot of these skeptics, oh, he has 12 or 15 craft, or there was 6 craft, or he was in all of them, and he did this and he did that, and none of it, they say, relates to anything Bob says. And the thing about Bob says is, for the lion's share, except for some minor details that changed over the years, based, I'm guessing, on memory and things like that, or maybe stuff that he didn't think of earlier comes back to mind, or things he he may have no longer dismissed him as not being an issue. It's the consistency. If you're going to be a critic and you're going to criticize somebody, if you're going to be a skeptic and you're going to be skeptical about something, get your effing facts as straight as possible, okay? Because you make yourself look like a moron or an idiot, or makes me less inclined to want to come back and listen to you rag on somebody else because whatever they say, whatever the story is, it's absolutely absurd, etc., etc. Details matter to some. You know, it just is my name, my belief. It's just like. Okay, Bob's reluctance to name names. You know, he knows probably a lot more than he's saying, and taking context, the literal context, the man got hired at his place very few people get to know about, and then he freaks out or has a little brain fart and starts blabbing to his friends because he's getting paranoid and followed, and et cetera, and so he takes them out there several times. They get busted. Oh yeah, they didn't take them off in the damn desert and shoot them. As much as they say that, you know, they don't really do things like that on a very rare situation. And in the case of the Bob Lazar story, most people didn't know about Area 51 and the connection to this UFO stuff to Area 51 until Bob Lazar's story came out. So probability is Bob was probably the first person, or one of the first people they ever had that they brought into that scenario who failed the scenario. They set him up, and he couldn't cope with it in his own way. He just got himself in Dutch. So they threatened him. They targeted him. They didn't kill him. That's obvious. They let him go. What else were they going to do? Well, they could have put him in prison for life. Well, they didn't know what they wanted to do. They weren't sure what to do. They never had potentially never had this situation come up. He also had witnesses. Inadvertently or purposely, by dragging in all those other people, if he suddenly disappeared, then they'd have to make everybody disappear. And there's a problem with that. The more bodies that disappear, the more questions that get asked. I mean, you just can't dump a half dozen people in the desert. You can, but there's the potential for it getting out and becoming a bigger problem is going to be there no matter what they say and do, right? So I look at Bob. He's an eccentric person. He's a bit out there. He's a kind of an eccentric genius or touched. He's easily bored. He is motivated for a number of things. Money is there, whether he wants to acknowledge it or not, because everybody needs some kind of financial support. I mean, fact is, he makes a comment in another video that somebody asks him about his Lamborghini, and he says, "Yeah, it's still sitting out in the backyard." So I don't know if he bought a used Lamborghini or a damaged one, and he meant to repair it or modify it, or he bought a brand new one. I mean, did he have that kind of money? We don't know what kind of finances situation is because nobody's really gone off and tried to find that. Couldn't find out old stuff after the stuff. He's got a paper trail now. Ever since then, he's had to have a paper trail. There's information there. I mean, it's like, the place names and people names. So right after his fallout with the government at S4, the government starts messing with him. It's in this period that's more and more of his personal details start to disappear. They're also harassing those he knows, his friends, his coworkers, anybody that contacts him and talks to him that has any knowledge or potential knowledge. They're mucking with them, either directly or indirectly, and they're screwing with their careers. So Bob realizes that if he when he probably did name some names early on, and then those names end up paying the price because the government couldn't directly go after him or wouldn't or chose not to. They went and targeted everybody else around him on purpose. They did that to harass Bob, to get Bob to shut up, and to make it so he was isolated from people or unreliable, and more people that he did know. So Bob just shut up in the aspect that I'll keep telling what I'm telling, but I'm not going to tell you the who. I'm not going to tell you who I know, who was there, or who I talked to, or my professors back in the day, because this guy and this guy, but also these guys and people that I knew as friends, and so on and so forth. Now, that brings me back full circle, and I know I talked about some of that in the previous video. I also promised to shut up and end this video a minute ago. I just want to touch one point on that again about the place things. I went to college in 2000. I was 30 odd years old, 32 years old, and I was there for 5 semesters. And I cannot tell you the name of one of my instructors. I cannot tell you the name of anybody that I was in my classes with. I didn't know nothing about them personally. We didn't hang out. We didn't go out to pubs for beer. We didn't go out to, the ball game. We didn't go to each other's houses. It just didn't care. It wasn't, I was there to get what I needed for my education, et cetera, et cetera. I was focused on that and my personal issues of the day and not on being a social whatever. So it's the fact that most people probably only recognize him by looking at him isn't 100% surprising. The fact that he doesn't know, have a whole phone book full of information of people to talk to is not surprising. In the early days, by handing that information out, it was sure as fire going to cause those people problems. Or those people would have realized that he was in Dutch and would have acknowledged or not acknowledged they knew him. They would have lied to protect themselves. That is human nature. That is my literal belief and opinion on that. So, till my next one, this is Rick.